Hey everyone, Tony D and Little Joan on another hot take. This one is about woke sci-fi. Yes. So let's start out with Doctor Who. Doctor Who, for those of you who don't know, was a great, and I say was, past tense, was a great BBC sci-fi show. And the premise was there's a guy who's an alien. He's a Time Lord. And the race of Time Lords, they build these machines called TARDISes, and they travel through time and space. And, they can, they have two hearts, and there's this whole mythos behind the Time Lords. And they're quite powerful beings. And Doctor Who, the Doctor, he's not named Doctor Who, he's called the Doctor, is the main character of the show. And alternatively, during the series and sometimes not, he's the last Time Lord. So he travels through time, and he has an affinity, of course, for Earth, and he comes to Earth often. And in the early days of the show, it was shot on the BBC backlot, and they had no budget, so it was a lot like Star Trek in that way. They created shows based on what they could do. So a lot of episodes of Doctor Who were about like the Doctor in the modern day, London or somewhere in the suburbs of England, running into some alien beings who were secretly plotting to, I don't know, drill a hole in the earth and blow it up, or, they had a secret base there and they were doing up to some nefarious no good, or their ship was trapped in an interdimensional space that was, half in Buckingham Palace in the modern day and half in Buckingham Palace in the 1500s or something. So it was this bizarro show that would have these very interesting, convoluted plots. And they would show them in half-hour installments, but they would be 2 hours. The stories would be 2 hours. So every half hour they had to have a cliffhanger if you watch them sort of unedited. And they would show it on PBS back in the day. And it was a very long-running show. So I think they're on their 13th Doctor. And they brought it back a few years ago, and they modernized it. And when I say modernized it, they added real special effects, like really good ones. In the past, it had always been very, very low-key in-camera stuff. But now they've got all the budget in the world. But this past Doctor, they decided was going to be woke. So the woke Doctor is a female. And she's the preachiest Doctor they've ever had. And the show's failing. And of course, people are blaming the fans rather than the show. I've never seen this before in the history of entertainment. This era is the first era where these producers actually have the unmitigated gall to blame the fans for their failure. You can never blame the fans. You can only blame yourself. If they don't like it, you failed. It has nothing to do with them. It's all on you. And the reason these shows have failed is because they're very preachy. And speaking of preachy, Picard, the spin-off of The Next Generation, is coming to the CBS, whatever that channel is. They already had woke Trek, Discovery, Star Trek Discovery. And I haven't seen an episode, but I've talked to some people who've watched it, and I've seen some of the punditry about it, and it's super woke. It's woke Star Trek. And now they're coming out with Picard, which is Jean-Luc Picard, coming back and being basically super woke, because he's already said in interviews that it's going to be about Trump and Brexit. On the one hand, the original Star Trek was about the Cold War. The Klingons were supposed to be the Russians, and the Federation was supposed to be the United States. But that was a different setting. That was a very clear-cut, the Soviet Union was very clearly a bad country that oppressed its people. What When you say, "Well, I'm going to do something against Donald Trump and Brexit," what you're not going after the Chinese or the North Koreans or the Islamic Republic of Iran. You're going after your fellow citizens who just happen to be in a different political party. So, we've reached this point in entertainment where now, entertainers have been on the liberal side of politics for a long time. And a lot of that was because the liberals were always the underdogs, and they sort of had the moral high ground with a lot of issues like, equal rights for marginalized groups like African Americans and gay people. So for a lot of years, they held the moral high ground in that. But now, that's not the case anymore. The Republican Party has evolved. Political parties evolve, and they can evolve good and they can evolve bad. The Republicans were originally the party of Lincoln. They freed the slaves. Now, not everything they did in the Civil War was good, but freeing the slaves ranks at the top of the list of good. After the Civil War, however, things got pretty corrupt after Lincoln died, and the Reconstruction basically ran the South and created a lot of resentment in the South. That created the Southern Democrats, and they were extremely racist. The Southern Democrats also included the KKK, and the KKK actually had members in Congress. They were a political party down south because the Republicans were so hated by the Southerners, they couldn't wait until they could run their own candidates, because for a long time they couldn't. After the Civil War, Confederate officers couldn't run for office. That was part of the deal. So a lot of people who would have run for office just were legally barred because they didn't want the Civil War to start up again. But that continued to create a lot of resentment until finally you had the reaction, which were all these horribly racist Southern Democrats. And one of them was Senator Robert Byrd, who he served all the way into the late 80s, I believe, until he died. And he was a mentor for Hillary Clinton. So the Democrats weren't always wonderful people who fought for marginalized groups. There were Democrats that were terribly, terribly racist. And people forget that history. Then they they transformed their party. They became the Party for the Worker. And they joined the Civil Rights Movement. And the hippies sort of were on the left side of politics, so they kind of got pulled a little further left with them. And as the hippies grew older, they became more like Democrats. So the Democratic Party evolved and became more progressive, but it wasn't always progressive. Now the opposite has happened. The Democratic Party is becoming increasingly more regressive, and at the same time, excuse me, my nose is running. At the same time, they're becoming more socialist and extreme. That division is pulling the Democrats apart, and you're probably going to see a massive civil war in the Democratic Party. The Republicans, on the other hand, have actually pulled in people because things have changed. The Republicans are not the racist big business guys they used to be. They started changing in the 80s. They were still not great in the 80s. I didn't like Reagan, but he was more of a big tent guy. He was more tolerant of people with different views and Republicans with different views. And finally, when Trump went on the stage at the GOP National Convention, he actually flew the rainbow flag, which finally accepted gays into the Republican Party. And this is a big step for them. For a lot of years, the Republicans were openly against gay people. I mean, just openly against them. There were, you remember, what's his face from Pennsylvania? I can't think of his last name. The guy who kept going on the floor of Congress and equating gay people with like bestiality and stuff. I can't think of that guy's name, Richard something. Anyhow, he was some right wing jerk congressman who would say all these outrageous things. Um, guys like him, they've had to either tone down their message or get the hell out. Now they have a more tolerant GOP. At the same time, the Democrats have become more intolerant. They are becoming the party of the rich, but not the rich big businessmen who have been classically associated with rich. They're the rich. They're catering to the rich Silicon Valley tech giants, the rich people in media, the rich actors and actresses. These people have become the elites. So things have changed. And you have to acknowledge that change. You have to acknowledge that change in your art. And if you're not, you're just behind the times. So I think what we're seeing here with Doctor Who and Picard, sci-fi used to be about looking into the future, and these guys aren't. They're not looking into the future anymore. They are taking the current situation, or as they see the current situation, and just extrapolating on it as if it's going to be the same, hundreds of years down the road. It's not. So, am I going to watch Picard? No, I'm not going to watch Picard. I never thought Next Generation was all that good. I mean, a few seasons, a few episodes were pretty decent, but I wasn't a huge fan. I mean, I watched it. I struggled through that first season because it was terrible. Then it got better, but I'm not going to watch it, and I'm definitely not watching The Woke Doctor. I haven't watched Doctor Who in a long time. I enjoyed the classic, early stuff and Tom Baker, but I caught a few David Tennants and a couple of guys, before and after him, but ultimately, it's not a huge deal for me to see a female version of a character. Like, that's not a big change. And with all this woke stuff, the moment I get a whiff of the woke, I'm out. I'm out. I don't want your woke entertainment nonsense. I don't need to be preached to. I don't need to, Doctor Who doing a thing on climate change on Earth. Doctor Who used to think big thoughts, big, huge sci-fi thoughts. Climate change, by comparison, is so tiny. It's so different. Or if they were going to do something on climate change, it would be so subtle you wouldn't even notice it until the end episode was over, and then you go, oh yeah, that may have been about climate change or whatever. There's no subtlety anymore, and it all goes back to what I advocate for is good screenwriting. And writers really just don't get the respect they deserve anymore, and I think this is a major problem. To hire woke writers is to hire very lazy writers, because they don't really have to think. They just have to be woke.